Good morning, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the dinner last night and you hope that you slept well. As you may have noticed or heard, the weather in the south of Iceland is very bad. So there are delays in flights. We can tell you more about that later, but that means that the Minister for Social Affairs and Housing and the Minister of Gender Equality, she couldn't come. She waited in the airport, but they're going to try the next flight at 11:15 or give information at 11:15. So we will just start the program. The Minister gives you her regards and this hopes that we will have a fruitful discussions and enjoy our conference while the weather is bad outside. The pollution is much, how do you say it? Well, it's not the same as yesterday. Situation is much better, so we can relax about that. But then we will start plenary number 5, and the moderator is Haukur Ingimundarson from the Stefansson Arctic Institute and University of Akureyri. Haukur, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes. Welcome back. Haukur Ingimundarson, the Stefansson Arctic Institute and the University of Akureyri, where I teach anthropology and gender studies and Arctic studies. But I am currently visiting researchers at Aalborg University, which is why some of you see me at Hotel Kea. Otherwise, I live in Akureyri. And we have a session called sort of theoretical session. Everybody has a PhD who is on this session. Just to say that now, instead of repeating it, construction and or reconstruction of gender in the Arctic. And first speaker is Firouz Gaini, who is Associate Professor of Social Anthropology at the University of Faroe, and currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Norwegian Center for Child Research. He wrote his dissertation on it's an ethnography of youth in the Faroe Islands, a pioneering study, and has since extended his research focus on towards the other northern North Atlantic islands. And he will be talking to us about masculinities. It's about time we talk about masculinities, so great. Welcome. Firouz. Oh, sorry, yes, the talk is called Boys Will Be Boys, Boys and Masculinities in Contemporary Greenland and the Faroe Islands.
Thank you very much. I believe there is an urgent need for more knowledge on boys' everyday lives and identities in the Arctic today. My conviction is based on own research findings and on recent discourse on welfare and gender in Greenland and the Faroe Islands. The problem, as I see it, is not that young men are underprivileged, but that they tend to be stereotyped as either heroes or villains without intermediary alternatives. This predicament is partly an outcome of men's lack of engagement in debate on gender issues. Especially non-academics from rural communities are hard to spot among commentators. Some of them might be ignorant, but this does of course not imply that men do not care about their status and role in society. We could indeed question the presumptions structuring formal debate and policy. How do we connect gender equality ideals to local cultural values and norms? How can we succeed making all main groups in society feel recognized and included in the project? So my call for a stronger focus on young men now is based on the impression that their gender identity is prejudged without much awareness of the cultural complexities of the late modern society. It is a deadlock that we can only find a way out of by addressing young people directly, inquiring their viewpoints and attitudes. With support of ethnographic material collected in Greenland and the Faroes, especially in the Faroes, during recent years, I will now elaborate my thesis by putting forward a few questions. How to illustrate differences between traditional and modern or late modern masculinities in the North? Greenland and the Faroe Islands are modern societies, yet important features of the traditional hunting and fishing community have persisted. My intention is not to romanticize the past, but to underline the cultural continuity in societies in shift. The fact is that it usually takes a longer time to change people's ideas than to change their environments. And most people are undeniably both traditional and modern at the same time. As echoed in the following quotation from a text by Paul Heelas, is it really reasonable to suppose that traditional societies can swallow up a person to the extent of muting or denying the exercise of autonomous voices, or to suppose that dwellers in modern or postmodern societies are content, let alone able, to live with little or no guidance from determinate orders? Physically demanding and hazardous hunting and fishing activities could be presented as archetypal characteristics of traditional masculinities in the North. Such enterprises are easily contrasted to, for example, urban intellectual working activities, and they are strongly male-dominated, hence easily rejected as incompatible with modern principles of gender equality in the labor market. A century ago, Sverre Pettersson wrote about Faroese men as hard-working and diligent sailors whom the country can be proud of. They do not have the newest and best equipment, but no one can match their pliability, capability, and dexterity in using the equipment at hand. This exotic portrayal of men as symbols of the nation narrates heroes in a kind of dangerous natural setting. The Greenlandic hunter was equivalently dedicated or courageous in such kind of narratives. Today, less than 5% of the Greenlanders are professional hunters. But the culture lives on through recreational hunters. A university-educated IT expert can easily spend his spare time hunting reindeer and fishing for Arctic char. As we see, most young men do not feel forced to bet on the one and to sacrifice the other when confronted with constructions of traditional versus modern lifestyles and corresponding masculine connotations. A young man from Ilulissat in Greenland tells, for example, about his close relation to nature in this way. Nature. I care a lot about nature. My dad and I have been hunting reindeer, caught seal and fish and trout in the river. You find yourself out there in the wilderness. So in the summer we collect eggs. They're very delicious. We boil them and dip them in sugar and eat them with fish, cod. You think more clearly when you're in the wilderness, without stress and depressions and all that. You're just together with nature and the silence. So you need that. Everybody, also they don't know that they need it, thinks more clearly in the wilderness. In another case, a man born in the 40s tells about his family life in Nuuk, in Greenland. Since I stopped fishing in 2001, it's me that takes care of and raises our children. My wife is head of department, so she works a lot. We eat a lot of Greenlandic food, and it is mostly me who cook. Are these persons traditional or modern? They are neither or both. Earlier this year, a young Nuuk schoolmaster shared his thoughts with me, saying, "Today, Greenlandic men have many practical skills. They are handymen or octopuses. They help in the house with childcare. Men are also supposed to be social and cozy. Earlier, they were hunters and did not take part in the work in the house. They did not take care of the children." This is an interesting observation that can easily be recognized from a Faroese perspective. This handyman is a flexible man that has less fear of contact to what is regarded as the domain of women. He just wants things to get done, so to say. This leads us to the next question. Can we see competing masculinities in society at the same time? If masculinity assigns to what is the correct way of being a man, as a kind of standard set of attitudes, values, styles, we cannot expect to find a model fitting all men in society. There will, though, according to Connell's theory, always be one hegemonic masculinity dominating the others. But whom will it represent? Men from the cities or the villages? Men from upper or lower classes? Young men associated to local or global youth cultures? Or is the hegemonic man maybe media constructed? There is no simple answer to the question, and I'm not sure it's worth the effort to try to give it a name. How can we, for instance, describe the situation of the pragmatic handyman compared to a highly educated specialist? Or in Greenland, how about the relation between Greenlandic and Danish men? What we can tell on a general level is that the so-called heroes of the past, the autonomous fishermen and hunters, in urban discourses often are labeled implicitly or explicitly as lost or self-destructive men who need to change their masculinity in order to adapt to contemporary society or contemporary realities. Some commentators, contrarily, as mentioned in the beginning, describe them as kind of role model for a troubled youth generation. In both cases, they are presented as the other in the modern globalized society. Per Konok Lynge, who has written a thesis about fishing families in Nuuk, presents this sad report of a young boy's first day at school. His contact to the school the first day is a memorable experience. As he stepped over the threshold and entered the classroom, he could feel that the school did not fit to him. He could feel that the school was not him and that they did not fit together. He could, in this regard, not at all understand what he could use the school for, and thus lacked motivation from the very first day. According to Lynge, the boys from the fishing families get a shock at school because the language, the culture, and the values are quite different from what they experience at home. There is no time to get into details concerning the current debate on the many boys' worrying struggle at school, but I would like to point out that educational achievement is an increasingly important part of the identity project of boys as well as girls. In late modern society, men are expected to make strong individual effort in order to gain respect and esteem among peers. You have to prove your value through education, through experience, through work, etc. Talking with young people from Nuuk about different gender-related topics gave me valuable material for reflection. One boy, aged 14, said about rural-urban differences. Boys in the cities have better school conditions than those living in the villages, but boys in the villages are better at hunting and fishing. And many boys and girls shared this opinion. Many young people expressed admiration for rural boys. And one informant said, for example, that boys from cities are less responsible. Some of the informants were also eager to tell their opinion on how they think men should be or ought to be. And one girl said, for instance, that a man should be responsible, independent, and sensitive. They also talked about the relation between masculinity and femininity. One informant focused on the new expectations concerning men's lives, saying that there is more pressure on a man today. For example, he should also be familiar with his feminine side. Another informant, according to this, along the same line, talked about how men are supposed to keep some of the old styles or skills, yet at the same time display more modern attitudes. A man should be able to be a handyman, but at the same time sensitive. Clearly, gender identities are changing. They are negotiated and put into new context. Young people are, we could say, testing and even mixing categories in order to find their own identities. Let us now take a closer look at the question of gender equality. How do young people look at the gender equality debate? Greenland and the Faroe Islands, because of their hunting and fishing traditions, have often been considered relatively male-dominated societies with patriarchic characteristics. But at the same time, they have also been described as non-hierarchical, family-oriented societies with high degree of gender equality. Carla Williamson says, for instance, in a text about the Greenlandic family and gender, much has been written about Kalalit families, centering on the patriarchy in the past, such that extended family ties were initiated through the fathers and male siblings. In today's context, this notion is challenged by our finding. Female family connections are the major ties today, compared with just a generation or so ago. More recently, during the last generations or so, the Kalalit have experienced a strong matriarchal society. Our results indicate that women are in greater control of social life than men. So, according to her, women have a much stronger position in society today compared to just a few generations ago. Birgitte Sonne, discussing male dominance in Inuit society, says that it was kept relatively at bay by the complementarity of the male and female labor skills. Similar changes are to be found in the Faroe Islands. For example, visiting the Faroes some years ago, the Icelandic author Guðrún Eva Minervudóttir made these observations of the local men. She says, "It takes a long time to find tough guys, the kind that sneer the way James Dean did on his motorbike. Faroese are mature and pliable, like modern incarnations of Buddha." Guðrún says that rudeness and arrogance are strongly disregarded by most Faroe Islanders. So, according to her observation or her experience, the stereotypes of sexist, macho sailors hardly fit to this image. Other visitors might disagree, and many Faroese women might also have experiences not corresponding to the Icelandic author's presentation. Anyway, the view from Iceland might also point out some ambiguities as regards the presentation of society in gendered fashion. How masculine was the past or is the present? The results of a school survey from 2010 causes concern regarding young people's opinion on gender equality issues in the Faroe Islands. Here are some of the results from a Nordic survey. 45% of the boys and 22% of the girls agree strongly or somewhat to the allegation that men are better leaders than women. The corresponding results for Greenland were 46% and 10% respectively. The opposite allegation, that women are better leaders than men, gave these results. 37% of the boys and 34% of the girls agree strongly or somewhat. The Greenlandic youth presents a very... It's finished? Okay. Yeah, 2 minutes. The Greenlandic youth presents a very different pattern. 18% of the boys and 54% of the girls agree to the statement. The allegation that overall it's better that men rather than women take decisions gave these results. 47% of the boys and 25% of the girls in the Faroe Islands answered that they agree strongly or somewhat. What do the young people think about women working outside home? 29% of the boys and 12% of the girls in the Faroe Islands agree strongly or somewhat that women should not work outside home. Corresponding results for Greenland were 6% and 5% respectively. So Faroese men, in this specific question, differ greatly from all other Nordic peers. This is interesting and worrying from a gender equality perspective. Asked directly if they think women and men should have equal rights, a large majority of the respondents is positive to equal rights for all. But the Nordic results also show one specific group with a much lower score than the others, the Faroese men. Only 58% of the male respondents from the Faroes agree strongly or somewhat to the statement. What we see, at least in the Faroese case, is that even if gender identities seem to change, gender values seem to stay unchanged. And this raises many questions that should be studied carefully. What we can conclude here and now is that Faroese youth, at least compared to the Greenlandic youth, as well as most of the other Nordic youth, is relatively conservative and traditional when it comes to gender equality values. Some of them might be even more conservative than their parents. So, to conclude, I started saying that we need more knowledge on the young men in the north, Greenland and the Faroe Islands. Then I try to give a picture of the youth generation with focus on the identity and masculinity questions. What appears is a fragmented picture with people in different positions and with different perspectives. We need more research in order to get a more comprehensive view of the life of men today. And men need to be treated more seriously in gender debates, because even if a group of men is still powerful and dominant in the political and economic sectors of societies, another group of men is getting more and more marginalized. And the latter group is also the most silent and invisible in the debate. But most men are positioned somewhere between these two, neither as winners nor losers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Firouz. Striking conclusions you reached. I introduce Þorgerður Þorvaldsdóttir, who has recently received her PhD in Gender Studies from University of Iceland and a Master's at the New School for Social Research, an excellent university in the US. And she is a postdoctoral researcher at the ETA Center of Excellence and is with the Reykjavík Academy. And she is going to talk to us about reimagining authoritative masculinity and the female slut. Snapshots from Reykjavík. Welcome.
Good morning all, and I want to start by thanking the committee for inviting me to talk here. For me, I mean, my PhD is in gender studies, and I was doing kind of gender policies and kind of policy making. In my talk here today, I'm taking you could say a detour. I found it quite challenging to connect to the Arctic and studies of the Arctic. I have to admit that, I've had trouble fitting my talk or my kind of line of thinking or research with this nice picture of the iceberg over there. It's not kind of in the same category. But nevertheless, so as I said, my focus here today will not be so much on the Arctic, but on contemporary, somewhat alternative gender images in Iceland, focusing on selected and somewhat outstanding individuals rather than groups. So I will look at kind of people or trends that are kind of not breaking but bending traditional gender images or roles. As a point of location, or where I'm coming from, I have earlier referred to an imaginary site which I've termed the gender equal North. And then for me, the North there refers to the Nordic countries and the fact that Nordic gender equality has been looked upon as some kind of role model in other parts of the world. And Nordic government have been eager to promote its positive representation. And this has already been kind of mentioned yesterday. And in relation to that, there is of course the it has been suggested that there has been an unofficial competition going on vis-a-vis which of the Nordic nation is the most gender equal country in the world. And the most recent forum for such competition is the Global Gender Gap Index, which was mentioned, yes, Kristinn and some other people mentioned it yesterday. It was first introduced in 2006 by the World Economic Forum, and it measures the gender gap between women and men across 4 key areas, and those are health, education, economics, and politics, and it measures the gap between the two. The Nordic countries atop the Global Gender Gap Index from the start, and astonishingly, in the midst of the economic crisis here in Iceland in 2009, Iceland claimed the top spot. Which, even more surprisingly, I have to say, it has maintained ever since, and the new gender gap index was just published this week, and we are still in the top spot. So for 6 years, we have been world leaders in gender equality, so to say. Earlier, in an article that I wrote in 2011, when I was part of a research project, it was called Iceland and Images of the North, and I guess that's somewhat why I'm speaking here today. This is kind of this North connection, but in that case, North was, as I said before, more Scandinavia and northern part of Europe. But there I proposed a 3-layered periodic division based on prevalent but often contradictory gender images in Iceland. And I'm going to use this schema as my starting point. Hence, I labeled the era from 1970 to 1999 a women's era or a feminist era, and the era from 2000 to October 2008 an era of masculinities. And then I always had trouble labeling the current era, but somewhat optimistically, at some point I termed the era post the economic collapse an intersectional era. Intersectionality was a central theme in my research, so I was very, very much into that. But in this presentation, I intend to revisit the utopian notion of an intersectional era, you could say era of diversity, and demonstrate how Icelanders might finally be turning intersectional after all. And for that, I will start by briefly mentioning Þorgerður, who was Iceland Prime Minister from 2009 to 2013. Then I will spend most of my time analyzing the image of Jón Gnarr, who served as the mayor of Reykjavík from 2010 to 2014. And then finally, I will shortly look at the Slut walk of 2014. So by bringing out these individual rather than focusing on group, I'm in some way responding to Unnur Brau's quest from yesterday of looking for kind of important role models, people who are doing things differently. But let's start with some clarification on the terminology in use, namely the term intersectionality. It derives from feminist theories of intersectionality, which shed lights on how various socio-cultural categories like race, ethnicity, nationality, class, disability, gender, age, sexuality, etc. interplay or interact and mutually construct one another. And related to that is the kind of more policy-oriented concept, gender plus equality policies. But the logic behind it is the belief that gender equality can never be accomplished unless we attend to all of its troublesome addition and strategically ask whether and then how or inequalities, how other inequalities based on class, race or ethnic origin, sexuality, age, disability, religion, etc., are tackled as well. So always look at the kind of how these different sections interact. But let's now turn back to Iceland, contemporary Iceland, and search from signs of what I have termed an era of intersectionality. In the aftermath of the economic collapse in 2008, foreign media highlighted the active role of Icelandic women in cleaning up men's mess, both in business and politics. And a key figure in relation to that has to be Þorgerður, a lesbian woman who has now turned 70, member of the Social Democratic Alliance, who after the so-called pots and pan revolution in Reykjavík in 2009 became the first female prime minister of Iceland and as importantly, the first openly gay prime minister in the world, and kind of received world recognition because of that. Hence, Jóhanna stands as a prototype for an image of Icelandic women who took on the task of cleaning up men's mess. And in addition, as an elderly lesbian woman, she can be viewed as a token of intersectionality, reaching its way into Iceland. But on the masculine side, and here I'm not so much talking about intersectionality, but more kind of bending rather than breaking traditional gender norms. On the masculine side, Jón Gnarr, who served as the mayor of Reykjavík from 2010 to 2014, embodied an alternative, slightly out of place, somewhat queer, authoritative masculinity figure. Jón Gnarr entered the political scene as a well-known comedian, but during his 4 years as a mayor, he gained international respect as an active spokesman for human rights. And this fall, he received a Peace Award from the Yoko Ono John Lennon Peace Fund, which he, by the way, donated the prize to the Shelter for Battered Women Center. So, great thing that. The economic crisis in Iceland resulted in a massive call for societal reformation, transparency, democratic decision-making, and a collaborative governing, instead of risk-driven masculinities or politics as usual. The frustration thus created a space for new authorities. And so Jón Gnarr and the Best Party, which was a collection of punks, artists, and comedians with no backgrounds in politics whatsoever, entered the political stage in Reykjavík, in Reykjavík's multiple election in 2010. Unexpectedly, the election turned out to be their victory, and consequently, Jón Gnarr occupied that new space as the mayor of Reykjavík from 2010 to 2014. And actually, in 2014, he declared that he would not run again, but opinion polls had showed that he had like 40%. So he would definitely have been elected, but he decided no, it wasn't. I mean, I never intended to be a politician. It was a kind of an interesting attempt or something. So he stepped out. But thereby, by stepping in at this time, he and the Best Party filled in a crack within other European countries, have been filled with fascist-oriented, far-right-wing, populist, anti-immigration parties like the Sweden Democrats in Sweden and the Danish Folk Party, just to name few. In an interview with The Independent, Jón Gnarr was quoted on the subject where he stated, "We are occupying a space that might otherwise be occupied by fascists." And he actually commented on earlier, it was his local conference in Reykjavík when he was commenting on this. And that was actually because I was not a supporter of Jón Gnarr at all. I actually really disliked him to begin with. But I think maybe at this conference when he's made this speech, he really, something turned on for me. And then he said, that he considered it a duty for kind of ordinary but relatively decent people like himself and others, to step in and take an active part instead of kind of setting aside and let the kind of evil forces win. So it was kind of this kind of duty of ordinary decent people to take active part and do something, as opposed to let this kind of other party. As a mayor, Jón Gnarr destabilized the image of the kind of powerful, almighty leader who is always an expert. And there was a very kind of awkward moment, especially during his first year in office. There were moments where he shyly announced in TV interviews that he had no knowledge on the subject matter at hand. So he needed to consult with specialists within the bureaucracy before making any comments and decisions. I remember watching this kind of TV interviews and really kind of feeling it in my skin. It was very uncomfortable because you're not used to see kind of leaders step in and say, "I have no idea. I've never done this before." Another very kind of troubling instance that also happened during his first year in power, and there he put kind of traditional authoritative masculinities together with his own integrity into question. And that was when he was traveling to, I think it was Belgium, and he went on a kind of international interview with a foreign news reporter who asked him about his use of the internet. And then he naively responded, "Oh, I mainly use it to look at porn." And I mean, this was the mayor of Reykjavík speaking, and there was hell broke loose. And consequently, the issue of pornography, its harmful effect, and the public use of it became a central topic, at least here in Iceland. And it was discussed, of course, in the media, on the internet, but also in public places, including the city council. It was actually brought up in the city council. And in the end, Jón Gnarr publicly apologized for this reprehensible comment, which he claimed was presented as a joke. And last but not least, Jón Gnarr demasculinized the position of the mayor by annually participating in the gay pride parade, wearing some highly political drags. And now you'll get some nice pictures. These are the first two, the first and the second. The first two drags were quite traditional drags, that is to say. But the fact that a heterosexual mayor gave an opening speech at a gay pride festivities wearing a drag was a political act in itself, and it's created a lot of attention. Then the third year, which is this one. He gained international attention when he put on the Pussy Riot gears to protest against the human rights violation and the imprisonment of members of the Pussy Riot in Russia. The last outfit, which is actually, in a way, my favorite, he put on the national female costume. But there he was responding to a strong nationalistic discourse that took place during and after the parliamentary election of 2013. And in relation to that, not so much to this outfit, but to this kind of strong wave of nationalism, he made this following remark on his Facebook site. He said, "There has always been a strange kind of nationalism in Iceland. It's a mixture of ignorance and arrogance, and my feeling is that anti-immigration is rising, and we may have some, and we are now using terms like Icelandic national culture or pure Icelandic." But by putting on the female national costume as a part of a drag show, Jón Gnarr thus both disturbed traditional ideas of nationalism and masculinity, and unsettled a sacred national value. And while I was preparing this, I actually remembered another instance, which I think it's interesting, and that's in relation to that. Almost a decade earlier, in 2004, this picture here of this black woman wearing the national costume was on the front page of kind of international paper that is published in Iceland called Grapevine magazine. And interestingly, this image created quite a stir. And actually more of a stir than the image, because Jón Gnarr appearance actually didn't create that much of stir. So this one was more troubling in 2004 than the Jón Gnarr in 2014. During his last year in office, Jón Gnarr also wrote a piece which received great attention, where he openly criticized the old-fashioned, power-driven, authoritative masculinity figure, which an Icelandic writer, Andris Snær Magnússon, had earlier identified in a celebrated article which was titled "In the Land of Crazy Men." Then he was really talking about environmental issues in terms of masculinity. But in relation to that, Jón Gnarr said this about the masculine auditorium. This is actually a picture taken in the city hall. These are the former mayor, and these sticking in between. But here's Jón Gnarr. "I have been fighting this man all my life. In his eyes, everyone who does not agree with him is fool and idiots. And women are either girls or broads. He is always in the right, he knows better than anyone else, and he is always correct. Sometimes he turns into a protector and an advocate for justice. Then he talks about issues like responsibility, safety measures, and fairness. He is everywhere, but I've never met him as frequently as after I started working at the city council. Now I meet him every day. He has great power. Only few dare to challenge him, let alone disobey him. Because who wants to come into conflict with him, see his staring eyes upon you, hear his ridicule, and called by a contemptuous name and the bullying? Few, since he happens to be the most powerful man in Iceland." But now, I know I'm running out of time, but I'm going to switch back to the feminine side. Wait a sec. And for that, I'm looking at the Slut book of 2014, which was perhaps the first occurrence where the feminist movement in Iceland appeared to be truly intersectional. A few words about the Slut Walk. It's a transnational feminist movement that started in Toronto in Canada in 2011. It has been held in Iceland now for 3 years in a row. So it started in 2012. It's a kind of young feminist movement. I mean, it's organized by kind of young active feminists. And it's a fight against rape culture. And what happens is that as women literally dressed like sluts, go walking, and they say, I mean, it's not how you dress. I mean, the blame should be on the violator, not on the victim, regardless of what kind of dress you're wearing. And what was interesting in the Slut Walk of 2014 was that kind of new voices were really brought in. Oh yeah, I want to add to this Slut Walk that, because I was already mentioning that we topped the Global Gender Gap Index. One of the things that are not measured there are sexual violence, and that's in that respect, Iceland is not scoring very high. There's a lot of trouble there, and that's where the focus of the feminist movement has really been in the last few years. So there were two very prominent speakers that I want to quote here, and that's the end of my talk. The former one was Cynthia Treliani, an immigrant woman from Asia who spoke of the innumerable prejudices which she encountered in her daily life in Iceland. And in her speech, she stated, I'm quoting her, "Our black hair does not make us invisible. Our black skin do not make us sexual, exotic creatures. The fact that our husband might be older than we does not make us male-ordered brides. The fact that we do not speak perfect Icelandic does not make us incompetent or uneducated. The fact that we try to avoid conflict does not make us submissive or obedient. The fact that we often go together to clubs for good times do not mean that we are prostitutes." So here she's really kind of, because issue of immigration, of immigrant women have not really been in the focus in Iceland, but there she's really kind of putting it to the point. Another kind of active, very great feminist that spoke on this person was this young woman called Embla Guðrún Ágústsdóttir, a young lesbian woman with disabilities who has been very kind of active in the public sphere in the last few months. And she articulated how ableism affects every aspect of society and turned her disabled body into a public property. And what she states, I mean, on the poster that she's holding, the poster states, "My body is not a public property." And then in her speech she said, "The shame was always mine. People point fingers, touch, stare, and ask questions about my body, like it's a public property, and I'm always supposed to be polite." This is endless kind of, this kind of childish quest for politeness and thankfulness. So, final point. Has Icelandic society finally turned intersectional? My answer is probably not. Questions of gender and gender inequalities, however, are not either-or questions, and I think that's important to keep in mind. It's important to look at the diversity within gender categories and always ask how gender can be done differently, bend but not break, and to acknowledge how gender intersects with other forms of inequalities, and to listen to critical voices, although they might contradict the glossy image of world leadership in gender equality that has been presented. So, thank you.
Thank you, Þorgerður, for inspiring presentation on people that inspire us. Absolutely. I introduce Valerie Alia, please, who is an independent writer and scholar, an emerita professor from Leeds Metropolitan University and associate of research at Scott Polar at Cambridge. She has written several books, and one of them called Names in Nunavut, I and my students were so happy to read in class in Anthropology of the Arctic. And one of her books is called, the latest one is called The New Media Nation, and thus actually addresses the talk. And please welcome. So the talk is called Gender and the New Nation. Oh, yeah, right.
The only power is
That's right.
me.
Yeah. Yeah, you don't have PowerPoint, right?
No.
Neither do I use that.
No, woman power, no PowerPoint. And if it's all right, I'll stay up here after maybe if we're going to have the panel. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. And I'll forget the sulfur dioxide. We won't talk about it again. When I got here, I met at the airport a very small girl called Fiola. And then I met a very small boy called Oscar. And it reminded me of, in a way, what we're doing here. I think this is, as much as this is about some of us with gray hair and some of us who are younger adults, I think this is their conference in many ways. So a lot of what we're talking about should really be addressed to them or for them, and pretty soon by them. Is this working? Is this all right? I just have to move this. So I want to talk about media, and I was very gratified actually to hear a couple of people yesterday mention the media, because somehow it's very often marginalized in these discussions, or it's thought of as something popular but not quite serious unless it's a meeting about communications. And I was glad to hear Natalia Kukarenko mention the importance of the internet and social media to NGO women. And I want to broaden the discussion and talk about an important and sometimes an invisible movement, but I do think it's a movement. The national and the private media outlets tend to be subject to the ever-shifting winds of political climate change. And women always got extra challenges. And here's a little 2-second history. In 1933, the BBC hired their first female announcer. Her name was Mrs. Giles Bourret. And they said she was great. She did a fabulous job, and they fired her. And they fired her because she had a woman's voice and was taking a man's job. And then a couple of years later, the United States hired its first woman broadcaster. And her name was Elsie Janis, the National Broadcasting Corporation, NBC. And listeners complained that a woman shouldn't be reading the news. So they didn't fire Elsie Janis, they just moved her over to lighter subjects. In Canada, women started being involved in radio in the 1920s, but it wasn't until 1991 that equality was enshrined in Canada's Broadcasting Act. That's a rather large gap of 70 years. Outside the mainstream, things did not look the same. Women were founders, technicians, broadcasters, writers, Katrina Jansen headed to Norwegian Sami radio for 30 years. Elena I'm going to do not well with the pronunciation, Larianova, founded Barron's Press with a group of female colleagues from northern Russia, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland. In Canada, Rosemary Kaptana was the first female president of the Inuit Broadcasting Corporation, which has always had women at every level of organization and production. Some of the most important and innovative media projects started in the Arctic and have always operated, sometimes at once, both inside and outside of national boundaries, or sometimes as separate branches of national media, as within the Sami radio in Norway and Finland. Some of them started as alternative services. And I'm going to borrow water. And when I say alternative services, these include what are called pirate radio stations, not quite licensed and not quite legitimate, but extremely present, especially in the Canadian North and the northern parts of the provinces. There were other forms, very small scale, high frequency transmitters that proliferated in some of the northern communities in Yukon and other parts of Canada, and served as emergency communications systems, but also became a form of local broadcasting. So there's an array. There's no rule about how this works. And I've sometimes referred to outlaws within this because there is an illicit side to it. And then sometimes it's very legitimized by funding and facilities and provided by governments. So Ian Eng talked about the transnationalization of media audiencehood. And what I've done is extended that to looking at a global picture, the internationalization of audiencehood and also production, and this is what I've called the new media nation. I think it's a movement, but it's a very, for broadcasters, sometimes a quiet movement, sometimes almost invisible. And I've looked at it globally, and the book actually goes global, but I'm talking today mostly about the manifestation of it in the Arctic. And the Arctic's been a founding region for this whole movement. So the other, and I'm not going to talk theory, but the other theoretical aspect that comes into play here is that the new media nation has taken advantage of what the feminist scholar Gayatri Spivak called strategic essentialism. So essentialism being a kind of stereotyping in a way, but instead of instead of focusing on particular qualities, particular cultural specifics, there's a focus on unified, what in this case could be called pan-indigeneity, a focus on what people share, and the purpose is political. So it's collective action of a kind, it's political solidarity. And in a way it's a fictional, so it's a fictional essentialism. And it's part of what is giving, what to me makes this not just a constellation of individual local outlets and journalists, but it's what for me makes it a movement, because there are many things, and we'll talk for a minute about that, that make it collective. The other aspect of it, which I find really interesting, is the truisms. It has challenge some of the truisms about how change happens and the whole idea of what's a dominant region and what's a marginalized region. Because in this case, most of the really exciting stuff happened, originated in the north and moved south. So we're talking about a so-called peripheral region. I don't like that term, but we'll use it. And moving towards a so-called dominant region, more populous, more politically powerful. It's not the way we were told things happened. It didn't start in Ottawa or Toronto or London or Reykjavík even. So it's been, I think I like seeing more powerful regions, and people have to learn from people who supposedly are less so. I think it's kind of a healthy trend. It's not just about news and information or entertainment. And here, someone mentioned yesterday scarcity of women leaders in the Northwest Territories, for example. And one of the things I've noticed, and I have not counted this, I'm a qualitative researcher, and so I cannot back it up with figures, but I can tell you that time and time again, everywhere I go in the world, some of the strongest female leadership, and in this case specifically indigenous female leadership, has come from people who were trained in journalism first. And I think it's really interesting, and in a way, there's a logic to it. You gain a voice. A lot of broadcasters, you're looking at world affairs. You're distilling news and information. It should make you a great politician, and sometimes it does. And just as an aside, the fact of getting women in greater numbers in positions of greater power is not a guarantee of a better world. It's just the direction we have to go in to make things more equal. But we can think of examples that each of us knows, including the current disputed election issues in Greenland with the female premier. I'm sorry that these things happen, but women aren't any more perfect than men. So it's not a guarantee. It's a place we have to start from. People have talked about the fact that women are entitled to be, mediocre women are entitled to jobs just like mediocre men are. It's not my idea of a beautiful world, but it's real. So a couple of examples. Rosemary Kaptana, who I mentioned, who was a visionary in many ways, a leader, she turned to politics and environmental advocacy, but she started in broadcasting. And in a way, it also makes you very comfortable dealing with media, which is also a good skill. She was one of the founders of Television Northern Canada, which I'll mention in a minute, which was a landmark program. And Mary Simon, who started as a print and broadcast journalist and became the first president of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, and then Canada's first ambassador for circumpolar affairs. And Nellie Cornier, who was mentioned yesterday, who was an announcer and a manager for CBC Radio. That's the Canadian broadcaster. And then she and Agnes Semler co-founded the Inuvialuit Political and Advocacy Organization, COPE, the Committee for Original Peoples Entitlement. And in 1991, after several years serving in the Northwest Territories legislature, she became government leader and the first Indigenous woman to lead a provincial or territorial government in Canada. Henrietta Rasmussen is chief of Greenland's national broadcaster, KNR. Her career kind of flowed both ways, but she's been a broadcaster and a politician and an international leader in many ways. She worked for the International Labor Organization. And she was one of the people who helped to create the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. So these are very special people who gained some of their political skills from experience as journalists, as broadcasters, and have flowed back and forth sometimes during a lifetime career path. The New Media Nation has been bubbling up all in places all over the world. In small places, there are countries in Africa and Latin America in which women's radio is very specifically women's radio and has fed into this whole pattern. So in some ways, it is a constellation of little stars in remote places, usually. Because again, this is a movement of people who have a hard time accessing what's considered the dominant political and social world, just by virtue of geography, very often, and also financial resources. I want to read you one quick quote from Paul Demain, who is a U.S. Native American Oneida Ojibwe journalist, who said, to me, one of the answers comes through Native people creating books, films, and radio stations. I believe control of one's own institutions is going to empower us. Being able to get the story, tell our story, work and edit our stories. For the first time, we're on the breaking edge of information technology in terms of computer systems and the internet. And we're back, which means we're going back to an old tradition, the oral visual presentation and the storyteller credibility. So he's connected. He's not the only Indigenous journalist or political leader to make that connection. A lot of people have talked about orality and oral tradition and the kind of organic sense it makes to go into broadcast. Am I on? Okay, I need my glasses. Is this 2 minutes or 3? 2. So then I will skip over some of there are a lot of examples in my book, and it's international, and we'll talk just quickly about the Arctic. Right now, the Inuit Circumpolar Council has an International Communications Commission, so that's a larger organization doing this. Not long ago, WITBN, the World Indigenous Television Broadcast Network, was founded. And Canada was the first country to develop a domestic telecommunications satellite system, and Indigenous people, and specifically women, have been at the front and center for the whole time. And Television Northern Canada was created to use satellite transmission and access the entire Arctic. It became, in 1992, it was founded and went to air, and in 1999 it was renamed APTN, the Aboriginal People's Television Network, and it is, to my knowledge, still the only full national Indigenous broadcaster created by Indigenous people. It's not an offshoot of the CBC, it's not an offshoot of any other state or private organization. It does a lot of exchange programming, a lot of programming with Sami Radio, because I've talked to people there who go to APTN all the time to pick up programming and drop some off, and also get some skills. Children's programming has been very important all along. This is where Oscar and Fiola come in again. I mean, there is a sense that this is where it has to be. And Lorna Roth calls calls it cognitive equity, the effort to create something which is a completely new worldview. It's not equality created by law. It's not equality where that's state-controlled. It's a new way of understanding what's normal. It's equality that's embedded in the human consciousness. And this is where I think the New Media Nation is excelling, because some of the children's programs are fabulous. Just a couple of other things. I mean, there are some of the developments, they're springing up faster than I can follow them, faster than anybody knows. And partly, a lot of it's low budget and things blossom and sometimes wither and then blossom again. There is several companies now developing fiber optic projects using the Arctic Ocean and Northwest Passage to connect Alaska, Greenland, England, and Japan. And ironically, the climate change that is threatening those regions makes the waters warm enough for this technology. So it's one of the plus-minus things. There's something called Barents Press, which was founded by women. And here's a description from its website, and I love it. Meetings are somehow messy and improvised, but the atmosphere is good and networking takes place all day and night. They're very proudly free of all private and government control and voluntary. And I guess the downside is nobody's earning a living from this either, but they're doing some quite remarkable programming. So all of this is in constant motion. It's not constantly going better and bigger and better and bigger, but it's there, and even countries that feel threatened have not been able to stop. And I think blogging, women are blogging their hearts and minds out, and I think the New Media Nation is thriving. And I'll stop because I have to.
So I ask the panelists to come up. Anna Karlsdóttir, Assistant Professor of Human Geography, University of Iceland, and Kristinn Schram, Director for the Center of Arctic Policy Studies, and they will be first asked to give their comments and little talk, and then the speakers as well up here. Yes, Anna. Yes.
Is this working?
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's just. Is it working? Try.
Do you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah. There's so much to say. You should start. Yes.
Thank you. I've taken notes from the presenters in this session, and I'm really, really thankful for some of the aspects that they have mentioned that have not been taken up so far in this conference, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I think there are some parallels in the talk of Firouz and Rasmus Ole Rasmussen, who spoke yesterday, in that in spite of men, boys being as diverse as you can imagine, and trying to break out of the stereotypes in many different ways, we're observing that gender values somehow remain unchanged. And so there's some work to be done about understanding the communicative patterns, the I and we perspective, and trying to implement some of those lessons learned into the educational system to enhance possibilities for both genders. And as was quite clear from Firouz's talk, the dichotomies and the contradictions, the black and white perspectives, the stereotype of losers and winners is absolutely useless categories to work with. And, but I would also like to emphasize that policies have a role in reshaping and reorienting gender identities. And I think Kristinn Ásgeirsdóttir, who introduced you to the Icelandic model of parental leave, I think that model in some ways has an impact on like subtle levels that we are only now sort of understanding. I heard referred to a new research on boys' aspirations and expectations for the future some days ago, and to my positive, or I became glad to hear that one of the main aspirations that the young boys in Iceland had for the future was becoming good fathers. And I'm not saying that we have not had good fathers in this country so far, but the fact that this can be openly acknowledged as an aspiration for the future among boys, I think that is the positive message. So let's also look at the subtle levels of change, of reorientation of identities, gender identities. I'm also glad that Þorgerður mentioned the Global Gender Gap Index. Icelanders are very, they like to air positive traits in society, and that's fine. But we also have some bleaker, indexes recently published. Iceland has, among the OECD countries, increased the increase of children poverty has been the highest in Iceland among OECD countries since 2008. And this fact reveals a picture in society of unevenness, of inequality among opportunities for children, depending on under what circumstances they are brought up. And single parenthood is, as Kristinn told us, a common characteristic of this society. And so this is probably one of the reasons why we've seen decreased possibilities among a part of the children of Iceland. We also have some meager results in terms of mental health. I'm not going to dwell on that at all because I know this will be talked about later. And then the use of sleeping pills is also, we have almost a world, at least a Nordic record. And so I think there are some socio-economic, conditions that are not too favorable for our world comparison. I came also to think about, in terms of the Global Gender Gap Index in Þorgerður's talk, that I've just recently heard a talk from a Japanese scholar who made a comparative research on the gender conditions between Japan, Sweden, and France. And to my, surprise, I guess, Sweden is one of the countries that has almost stagnated the last 10 years in this gender index. And it would be, I think, favorable to know or get to learn why is a almost a world very highly ranking country as Sweden not progressing in this direction. I think it's a problem how we label people, and we have a tendency always to label people maybe for the ease of understanding in a very too simple manner. And therefore I favor very much Jan's statement yesterday that diversity and inclusion should be the leading words. I believe also Heather talked about colonialization and settlers' colonialization, and then I'm coming to something that I feel has been lacking in our discussion so far. That's the question of how we perceive our communities, our societies in a sort of a multifunctional way, multicultural way. Why are we not including all the immigrants that make up for the, well, considerable part of the new population in many of the regions and areas we're presenting here? And fortunately, Þorgerður also mentioned this. And I think that we have an assignment in front of us in the circumpolar Arctic to reshape also not only the gender identities, but also we need to address reorientation of national identities. And I'm not sure that intersectional is a useful theoretical term. Gender is a social construction. Maybe it's better to apply some kind of acknowledgement of diversified or more diversified human capital, really. And then I'm into Valerie's talk about importance of media and how media has played a crucial role in voicing the interests and voices of minorities and marginal people and places on the edge of the world. And it made me think about a presentation I heard on Chinese or male university students recently, and how they sort of have in different life strategies, they can sort of play between, if they're losing out at university, the formal educational level, they can even have a different capital in terms of MOBA playing or game playing on the net, because you can actually take on multiple identities or parallel identities or alter egos or whatever you call it. And so I think the society should acknowledge that we need transformative skills. We need, and societies like in the Arctic experiencing change driven by technology, environmental, social, cultural, and economic forces should look at this. We need transformative skills, and I'm going to remain at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristinn.
Yes, well, thank you for that wonderful summation. Regretfully, I missed yesterday's talks. I came in rather late. Speaking of masculinities, you must forgive me that I'm unshaven this morning. I forgot my razor in Reykjavík as well. But thank you very much for these wonderful discussion this morning on how, while gender realities may change, gender values may lag behind, and counter-narratives may emerge in a semi-intersectional period, if we may call it thus. But I think these dynamics of gendered identity constructions are extremely important, not least looking at the relationship between hegemonic, regional, and national representations of people in the Arctic and gendered identities. My research partner, Karlsdóttir, and I have focused on such representations in art and media and the uses of those representations by people in their everyday lives, not least in Northern Europe and in the West Nordic Arctic, as it has been called rather recently. Drawing on an image of untouched nature culture, public representations of Iceland have also been based on earlier exoticizing discourses. With growing practical involvement in the Arctic, the question of Iceland's Arctic identity has come to the fore, and not only among officials staking a claim in Arctic cooperation. In the wake of a fading militarized bipolar paradigms and a growing awareness of common ground with its geographical neighbors, one could expect a strengthening awareness in Iceland of a North Atlantic or Arctic identity. And indeed, while Iceland's official Arctic strategy, with its emphasis on Arctic coastal status and a Nordic or West Nordic cooperation, has only recently formalized, actors in the fields of advertisement, arts, and popular culture have for a long time cultivated on the aesthetics and discourses of the High North. 19th and early 20th century Icelandic nationalists rejected this exotic image of themselves, stressing their modern Europeanness, sophistication, and developed, all by a deep-rooted literary culture. In turn, they expressed abhorrence for the allegedly primitive nature folk that they saw on the other side of the culture-nature dichotomy. Today, by contrast, representations of culture in the North Atlantic have again become increasingly infused with images of nature folk rather than culture nations. Examples of this abound in visual images, especially in advertisements, film, and art, centering on and manipulating an iconography of rugged male northernness. In contemporary times marked by international market forces, tourism, and global media, Icelanders are no longer simply reluctant receivers of exotic representations, but have become to an extent their active performers. The remoteness and Arcticness of the West Nordic region has thus become increasingly visible in representations of Iceland in promotional material, such as the tourism campaign Inspired by Iceland. A number of Icelandic artists have also played with gendered regional themes related to the North in their work. Two examples are the musical artist Björk Guðmundsdóttir and visual artist Ragnar Kjartansson. Although a cosmopolitan performer, Björk has put Iceland on the cultural map to the extent of becoming its best-known spokesman. The image of Björk, presented in international media and video performances, expresses a synergy with Icelandic nature, and she rarely gives an interview without mentioning her strong emotional connection with nature and affection for her homeland. Björk has made various overtures to other North Atlantic countries, for example, including a Greenlandic choir in her musical performances. Another example is the rising and internationally acclaimed visual artist Ragnar Kjartansson, who also plays with the themes and threads of the North, such as masculinity, heavy drinking, and melancholia related to dark winter months. Ragnar engages with both the Scandinavian and North American notion of the dark male Arcticness and Scandinavian pain, as one of his shows is called, but also evokes provocative images of colonialism and Iceland's past in the Kingdom of Denmark. In the everyday lives of people, such representations do matter, and perhaps this is most evident in the experiences of mobile people. Whether driven by the acquisition of routes, markets, territory, or natural resources, or the pursuit of social capital within new communities, mobility is a crucial factor in Arctic self-awareness and identification, and provides an important component of what might be called globalization from below. This issue is of growing importance, considering movements within the Arctic zone that may be forced by climate change and the expected influx of people and resources into the region in the foreseeable future. Workforces for large-scale projects will form a significant part of this, but no less important are the professional and creative classes who are influential in structuring and sustaining the region, both socio-economically and culturally. While Icelanders are few in number, they are generally mobile people both within and beyond the Nordic context. Gendered and national identities play a significant part in the everyday power relationships of these groups and individuals. Exotic images of the North have played a considerable part in the everyday life of Icelanders abroad, not least during the period of global expansion and booming Icelandic business adventures around 2000 to 2008, known as the Icelandic Raid, or Íslenska útrásin. Today, Icelanders form, for example, one of the largest expatriate groups in Greenland. Many of them went there looking for opportunities during the economic crisis in Iceland. And recent ethnographic research in Greenland have found, interestingly, that despite their disparate cultural backgrounds, many Icelanders and Greenlanders speak of their mutual affinity while feeling separate from Danish or other ethnic groups within the country. Incorporating themes of shared colonial history, close ties with nature, and initiation rites through hunting trips, and shared narratives show how any ethnic rift between Icelanders and Greenlanders are to some extent bridged through a West Nordic identification. One can detect many ambiguities in Iceland's Arctic and West Nordic identification, and especially in the conscious use of identities, stereotypes, and images. We have seen that there are signs of some cultural basis for these facets of identity and for the behaviors and relationships that draw on them, reflecting, inter alia, a perceived colonial history, exoticized representation of the North as periphery and extreme, and the affinities among a diverse and increasingly mobile West Nordic population, as well as environmental and economic realities. Stressing such factors can often serve Iceland's practical interest in establishing its distinctness and branding itself as a material and cultural producer. On the other hand, Iceland's non-state actors then become thoroughly engaged in the dynamics of globalized market forces and geopolitics. Like business and governmental players, they emphasize different regional and gendered identities when it suits them, but sometimes they may also be ahead of the tide and can offer counter-narratives to official discourse. But they have found themselves on the slippery slope of appropriating or reappropriating exotic regional and gendered representations. And I'll stop there.
Thank you all. A lot of food for thought and urgent questions and comments. So I open the floor for questions from the audience and comments and opinions.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inspiring comments and ideas. I would, especially connected to the last comments, ask the panel working in the North Atlantic region, to what extent has the past relationship to the sea and involvement in fisheries and hunting establish this kind of diversity in, but also similarity in the approaches towards gender. Division of labor might have had some impact on it, and then the fact that the change in the business activities during the last couple of years might also have impacted the level of changes in these traditional structures.
Well, yes, I think there's been a lot of change just in recent years in these aspects, and regarding the relationship between Icelanders and their neighbors to the east, there's been great change. Of course, there's been a lot of cooperation in fisheries, but one also sees an exchange of goods that influences everyday life in many ways. Just visiting Nuuk, you see a range of dairy products, for example, and you see a cultural exchange that is burgeoning with what has been before. But I must stress that a lot of these references, for example, to colonial history, it is very much a perception, a perceived shared colonial history rather than historical realities that are drawn forth there. And people cement relationships based on in very much ways, obscurities of history. And it relies a lot, I think, in the possibilities of the future rather than in the hard realities of the past.
Can I comment or try to also respond to this? I think now I'm referring mostly to Iceland, but this is also transferable to many other areas in the Arctic. We have a fisheries sector that has been gender segregated labor-wise, and there's been clear gender division in tasks taken care of. I would say with modifications, but because we have, of course, had courageous women fishermen, but they have not been the majority of people. But with I guess the impact of industrialization of the fishery sector here in Iceland, we experienced to a large extent the sector losing its status, and as Iceland became more and more urban also. So actually the fishery industry in Iceland has had to compensate the loss of people from the areas where they depend on those jobs with immigrant labor. And I believe this is not an Icelandic phenomenon at all. This is a very general in and across the northern areas. And somehow this is not addressed, but in policies, I think, and there is a lot of job to be done there. That said, I also think that the loss of status that the ocean had in Icelandic society has to some extent been brought back by virtue of more educated women entering into different levels and functions within research, research and development, and we've recently established an organization of women in the fishery sector. To my, regret, or I can see that most of the women that are very active in that organization are like upper hierarchy strata, educated women in middle management positions. Not so much the big part of the labor that is involved in the fish processing. So we have some class issues that we need to address, I guess. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. My name is Hjalti. First, a little comment I wanted to say about Jóhanna Sigurðardóttir, that I think she will go down in Icelandic history as one of the most remarkable politicians of our time. Same can be said about Jón Gnarr, actually. And if they will not go down in history as such, it will be because history was written by the wrong people. I wanted to make a comment. It goes to Firouz. We had a subculture in Iceland that we called hnakkar, or necks. We could call them bleach necks as opposed to rednecks, probably. We're very focused on personal grooming and appearance, which stereotypically has been associated with gay men. So perhaps as a way to compensate, they were fiercely misogynist and almost violent towards outspoken women, especially feminists. I was wondering if that's something you could see happening in Greenland, for example. Well, as a way to identify your own masculinity.
I think it's in my material from Greenland. I don't have much information that leads in that direction. But from the Faroe Islands, for example, we have many different subcultures among men and among young people, and the subcultures and youth cultures are also have characteristics regarding their view on, of course, towards women, towards gender questions, femininity, masculinity, and we have many young men from some subcultures that have very sexist attitudes and negative views and presentations of women, and where that is a part of, at least implicitly, maybe they don't say it explicitly, a part of the identity in the group, kind of capital, you could say, among the men. And it has been, youth cultures are changing quite fast, even if some of the gender values might be more stable, as we saw in the statistics. But among some of the working class fishing families, more maybe traditional part of the fishing industry, it has been very what do you say, a clear part of some of the masculinities, yeah, so that they're their own kind of macho or this kind of image of how a man should be has been very narrow in a sense, both towards other men, more maybe urban or metrosexual or whatever you will call it, but also, of course, towards the women. What work the women should have, if they should stay at home, which influence they should have in local society, etc. I don't know if that is comparable to what you're saying. So, yeah. You talked about violence also.
Well, they were very misogynist and resulted in verbal abuse of women and feminists especially, and threats of violence.
Yeah. Okay, we have two more hands up. We'll go a little over here.
Okay, I like very much this morning's discussions on masculinities and crossing those stereotypical borders in doing that, and also in doing research, and also in reflecting the question how to interpret the phenomenon you have in front of you. But then I started to think one issue, and it is the interpretation connected with values. Of course, it really seems to be so that the values might be more stereotypical than already a certain part of practical everyday life. But then I was thinking that was one problem that maybe those ways to focus on values also need to be reconstructed and developed, because those statements, maybe would it be possible that they were presenting sooner stereotypical attitudes than values, and those were focusing on issues. I understood that you asked those issues children, but however the focus was on issues that are far away from that day's life. So maybe those focused more on attitudes and stereotypical attitudes. But as a whole, it was very interesting, your speech. It was very interesting, and research too. But I think we have a more quite general level challenge also to develop our ways to measure issues, to find out also those nuances that are so important to find out when looking at change.
Okay. Maybe that was more of a series of comments than a question, unless somebody wants to. But we have one more. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Jóna Karlsdóttir. I would like to ask you, Gaini, about your last slide, the picture about women, and you asked the kids about if equality, there should be equality between men and women. I would like to ask if it's possible to get them all to say yes, and the age of them. Why didn't they all say yes to the question?
Yeah, that's a good question. This was a Nordic survey, school survey, and I took care of the Faroese part of it, and I think that these tables they give us some kind of some quantitative data, while I'm usually working with qualitative data, and it can be used to give somehow a kind of framework or show some pattern, but it should of course be interpreted very carefully. And one thing is the methodological also and technical part of it. How do the young people, and these were around, they were not that young, they were on average around 17 or 18 years old, those that took part in the survey. How do they interpret and look at these concepts of, for example, gender equality? They might have partly other viewpoints than we have. As for some, this is just a reflection. I haven't double checked it. For some, it might be not equal opportunity, but doing equal work or doing the same thing that might influence some of the results. But I think that those, if you really want to use those results, you have to put them in context, and you have to use also qualitative interviews and go further with the questions, because otherwise it's very difficult to use it. It's somehow so isolated, or you have to. You can do a kind of statistical analysis with comparing with the other questions, but I think definitely you should also add a qualitative dimension. So it's somehow, I was in doubt if I should bring it into my presentation, because it does maybe not fit very well to the rest of my presentation, but I still thought it could be interesting to bring those results. But I don't know if as some other presenters have mentioned earlier, I don't know if there is any goal to get everyone to answer the same way, or if that will necessarily lead to a better situation regarding gender equality.
I'm afraid this will have to be the last famous last words before coffee and water fix. But I certainly have questions for this group for the summary session later in the day. So we will revisit. Thank you all.